Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see you all here. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. Of course, mostly new faces, since I haven't been to Washington, D.C. for years. It's amazing to look at the art in the next room in some ways as an outsider, as a visitor to your city, because this art is from the artists that we work with every day or that are part of the community that we live with. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about, sort of paint a picture for you with the panel of the world that this art comes from, which is a part of the world that we all share, and help sort of round out the story of what you're seeing on the walls. It's been such a pleasure to work with the Middle East Institute, Lynn Snej and Kate Seeley. Thank you both so much for your grace and your persistence in helping pull off something which is kind of a miraculous exhibition process. And thank you also to the UAE Embassy and your consistent support of the cultural activities. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to try to talk as little as possible to get you guys going. Maybe we can have a healthy debate or not. So the bios are all in here, and I'm going to only introduce the panelists very briefly. And if you read more detail in their bios, and then I invite the panelists also to add in more about their own biographies as they go, because what you see on the page and who a person is, you can never quite translate that. So Munira, I'm going to introduce sort of on a more personal level. I've known her for quite a while, most of the time that I've lived in the UAE, which is 10 years. And I've watched her become the curator that she is today. I think she was already well on that path by the time I met her. And she has recently founded the Darwaza Curatorial Lab, is that right? Yep. Which is this incredible creative incubator, and it's exactly what the UAE kind of needed, which is sort of less formal structures for connecting across different arts activities. She is also she was advising and curating for Expo 2020 in Dubai. She's part of the UAE Ministry of Culture Visual Arts Committee and on Dubai Collections Steering and Curatorial Committee. And for those of you who don't know what these terms refer to, these are all really important sort of leading organizations in the cultural sector in the UAE. So she has a voice in and is playing a part of all these different areas of cultural activity, including on the advisory council of the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery. So it was such a delight to hear that she would be curating this exhibition, because she also makes it a point to really learn about who the artists are rising today in the UAE, and has brought to my attention artists that I didn't know about. And I think that her ability to see and recognize talent and trust what she sees is one of the most important parts of what a curator can do for contemporary art. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And I want to start by asking you to tell, what I'll do is introduce each of you and then ask you a question. So like a party game. So, so for you, the question is, tell us the story of how you came about the idea for this exhibition and how you view the thematics that have emerged in the course of developing the show.
I think, is this on? Yeah, you can hear me. Great. I think for this exhibition, what was interesting is I started to look at artists I was interested in initially, and first and foremost. And then I began to realize that, there's definitely like different people from different age groups, different generations, yet there is a similarity that really kind of visually presented itself for me. So from that, and the plenty of conversations that I had with Danny and yourself, of course, I began to kind of pull away thematics that really presented themselves conceptually. And I think just in line with the 50th year for the UAE, and in that celebration and in that notion, it was important to see what crossed over from the artwork that was also in the same dialogue as what we're doing with regards to the celebration of the Jubilee year. And so from that, the theme kind of really allowed itself to take place. The title of the show came one day I was looking out at the sea, and I was just thinking about this idea of what exists between the sky and the earth. And that sort of space and liberty to be able to express and explore is definitely what the UAE is to me today. And it was very important that we were showing artists from the Emirates and not technically only Emirati nationals, because that is the reflection of the reality that we're living. And yeah, so it kind of just came together nicely from there.
And would you say that that of the sort of emerging and established artists working today, are we seeing 1%, 5%, 50%? Do you give us a feeling for what's out there to be discovered?
I think 5% maybe, if that. I'd give it between a 3 to a 5.
Of like actively working,
yes, there's
seriously committed artists.
What's incredible is every year you're brought more artists from different fellowships, you know, and you start to really follow the artist's career from the very beginning. Yeah. And I think that that's what's extremely cool. And you know, keeping your ear on the pulse is extremely important. Being involved in the initial sort of interactions artists are having with the art scene is important, because that's where the conversations take place. That's where you can begin to understand their practice, but also define it in a way or give it some sort of direction, of course, through these conversations that are being had. There's a lot going on in the art scene right now, back home, as you would know.
It really is. And I think we're going to come back to why it's so striking in this particular moment, because it is really remarkable. Even in the 10 years, I feel like there's been this just explosion of activity, 100%. Which I think was always there, but now we're really seeing it on the surface. Hashel Lamki, also a personalized introduction. I've known him slightly less longer, but he has played a really important role specifically in Abu Dhabi. We have a lot of arts organizations and artistic activity that became visible earlier in Sharjah and in Dubai. And Abu Dhabi was always a little bit of a quieter town. The artists, of course, have always been there, but Hashel has played a role in helping make visible even more of the artists that are there, partly through, can I mention Bait 15?
Yeah.
It's a secret hideout for artists in Abu Dhabi, has now been revealed. Which was a house that was converted into a set of studios for many different kinds of artists, for gatherings, for events, and also for exhibitions. And I think this sense of kind of grassroots conversations among artists and curators and so on has been one of the hallmarks of the last few years in Abu Dhabi. In particular, that I think we're finding it very kind of encouraging and heartening. That there's support coming from the government level, but there's also support coming from people like Hashel Lamki. So thank you for the work that you've done to encourage artists to be visible or hidden in the secret clubhouse. He has exhibited in solo and group shows throughout the UAE, including at Abu Dhabi's Warehouse 421. And this was a show that was curated by Munira recently, the solo show, The Cup and the Saucer. He received a BFA from the Parsons School of Design and has been awarded several international fellowships, including from the Salama bin Hamdan Emerging Artist Fellowship, which is in partnership with Rhode Island School of Design. And this we call this the SEAF Fellowship. And this really is kind of a very interesting group of each year of a new cohort of artists who have an intensive studio year. And that is part of this series of communities that we'll talk about. So, sorry about the preamble there. So what I would like to ask you about is if you could talk about the painting that's on view in particular, but also, the very first time I saw your work was at the SEAF show, and that was where it was just this explosion of sort of collage and installation and lights and found objects, and quite a bit different from what we see here. And yet both of them feel completely like the artists that I know. So can you talk us a little bit about this painting and sort of where you are with your work right now and your practice?
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah. The painting that it's exhibited at the exhibition outside, titled The Day We Met Thomas, and it's a very personal moment in my career as an artist for 10 years now, since I graduated from Parsons. I would start with with Edward T. Hall, where he says man and the environment shape each other. And that's how I see my practice like slowly evolving and understanding where I'm placed and what is around me and how can I respond to. Recently, I've developed like a lot of interest in natural pigments and how do I respond to the earth that I am part of. So I've been traveling along Oman and Marrakesh, specifically Salalah and Oman, and in Morocco and Marrakesh, where I'm trying to trace like few artisan communities that existed, and somehow throughout, the let's say, the evolution of us as a species, like we've lost like these very personal or like very hands-on techniques, and I wanted to like gather like these pigments and try to a little bit like preserve like something that it's lost, or like industries that are dissolving slowly, or also economy where like there was like families who are based using these techniques. And throughout these like multiple trips, like I would gather like the pigments and then try to test in my studio. And it's like slightly a shift where I'm more like responding to the surface that I'm applying the pigment on. And the idea of like addition and subtraction, there is like a process where I apply the pigment and then I wait for it to do its magic, and then I respond to it. And then also reflecting on landscapes, like I'm from Al Ain. So UAE consists of like 7 emirates, and Abu Dhabi is the biggest emirate. And Al Ain is a city within Abu Dhabi. And for the longest time growing up in Al Ain, the mountain Jabal Hafid was the reference point for everyone who lived there. In particular, late Sheikh Zayed have mandated that Al Ain should be what do you call it, like a low-rise city in terms of like construction. And I talk about construction as well a lot in my work, where we had a rapid construction boom like early 2000 with Dubai and Abu Dhabi. But I had the opportunity or the pleasure to always just be connected with nature. And as I grew up in Al Ain, as the city is like kind of governed to have this mountain view, and you can see the mountain throughout the city. But what's interesting about the mountain as well is actually the tectonic plate where it is today is actually originated from Africa. It's separated throughout like, the time of history. It is in constant motion. It's separating by 5 centimeters north. So what appears to be static is actually, it's making its own subtle movement, and it's moving. It's a landmark for everyone who is familiar about Al Ain. So I refer to the landscape a lot in my work. And through my training in Parsons in particular, and like, my introduction to American landscapes and the idea of like plein air and like being outside and just responding to nature, I wanted to push a little bit the conversation beyond like oil and canvas, and like apply different mundane objects. Like the work that we have here is actually cotton bed sheet. And just to tie in a little bit, I live above a supermarket that it's 24/7. So sometimes I run out of material, so I go back to the supermarket to get things. But it's also like responding, to who we are as species and our evolution. And yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't actually realize the part about the pigment work that you're doing. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know, it's the large paintings that you see when you first walk in, and they have sort of hints of landscape, mm-hmm. but also they feel like just this sense of motion through the mm-hmm. air. And I'm really glad you described the movement of the mountain, because there is that sense actually in that painting of the mountains moving. And I would never have made the connection between the tectonic plate and thank you so much. And okay, and then finally, Solimar Miller. This is my most recent artistic discovery, who has in fact evaded my watchful eye. She's been here in Dubai for over 20 years. She's a textile designer and printmaker whose work explores the natural world and climate change. And she documents the beauty of the region's indigenous trees. So the work that is of hers that's out there is this. You'll see it near the window on the left. She received her BFA in Textile and Surface Design from the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. And she's widely known for her textile and surface design for luxury hotels and brands. But this is where this brings in another aspect of the art community in the UAE. She's a member of the Tashkil Studios in Dubai, which is how many people have learned about her work. And Tashkil is a really important center for making, but also for exhibiting for emerging and developing artists. She also comes from a family of artistically inclined people, which I'll leave that to you just to talk about how much of that is you'd like to. But I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your process, but also how it relates to what you witnessed 20 years in Dubai. I mean, for anyone who knows the history, the visual history of Dubai, she would have seen incredible change in such a quick time, even in 10 years. But 20 years, I think you would have seen quite a bit. And I find it really interesting that you're sort of zooming in when the world has this zoomed out view of Dubai's change. You're zooming in on indigenous plant life, which I think is very telling of how you're responding to the change. So could you tell us about your process?
Yes, well, I moved to Dubai in 1997. So when I first moved there, the tallest building was the World Trade Center on the Sheikh Zayed Road, which you can barely see now. And the landscape has changed immensely in the time I've been there. And I've seen the natural landscape decline and more concrete and steel come up, which is a natural evolution for a city, for growth, for change. And it's also a reflection of the drive of, I think, the Emirates, and even from Sheikh Zayed's vision and Sheikh Rashid of Dubai, and all of the Emirates. I think they're and the Sheikhs of Sharjah who have had this vision of the Emirates. Really, there's been this drive, this really positive energy and drive, and how they attract so many nationalities. And one of the things I always loved about the Emirates was all these wonderful, the interactions of all these international people. And when I first moved there, I left New York. I was designing custom design carpets, and I was always drawing and painting in my own time, but I was in the design field. But when I moved to Dubai, I felt kind of lonely because I didn't find artists and creative people. It wasn't happening yet. And now it's just amazing how the art scene has grown, and with Munira's vision and the team and the positive people in her round, like Danny and Hashel, and the amazing work he's doing. I'm so inspired, and I'm grateful. I'm a part of the Tashkil community in Dubai, which was founded by Sheikha Latifa. And it's a community of artists, and it's a facility where there's studios and there's workshops, and there's places I can create and experiment on my process. And my work, I think, as I've seen the changes and the growth of Dubai, because that's where I live, but I know it's happening in all the Emirates very well. Just seeing like trees coming down, like literally, like driving over the years in Nad Al Sheba and different parts of the Emirates, and I just driving in the same road and then seeing really big trees coming down. I actually was really upset by this. And it kind of changed my focus. I mean, I've always loved the environment and trees and the natural flora, but it made me feel really concerned. And I thought, wait, this is happening too fast. You know, it's like the city, the growth is so fast that there isn't enough thought into maybe preserving the old trees and flora. But the beautiful thing is the Gaf trees have been protected, which is a really amazing and beautiful initiative from the rulers and the people who are behind like protecting these old trees. It takes so long to grow and flourish. But I think my aim is I'm very inspired. I love the Emirates. I love the natural landscape. I love the cities, of course, but the trees and just the way climate change is going at such a fast pace in the whole world. It's like I'm trying to preserve it. Like, oh, I need to capture these trees. And I go around the Emirates and locations where there isn't a lot of built up, you know, buildings and construction going on, and I photograph, and if the weather permits, I'll sit there and draw the tree, and I get really close to the structure. I really study it. I really, you know, I feel a connection to what I'm doing. And I take these photographs home, and then I refer to them, draw them, you know, with graphite, or I'll paint with black ink or gouache. And then I take them through a process and take them to Tashkil and, you know, prepare emulsion and it's a whole long process.
It's a screen print, right?
Screen printing, yes.
Yeah.
And layering
layers
the trees
of it.
And you know, playing the colors off of each other and that kind of relationship. And so
it would be great sometime we should do a diagram and name what all the trees are. I think I can see a Gaf tree, at least one in here. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. All right, so now the art scene in the UAE. It's interesting that you mentioned the 1990s, because one of the stories that I've heard is that curators came to the UAE in the early 1990s in search of contemporary art, concluded that there was none, and went home. And in fact, there were artists working, but they were very hard to find, partly because the institutional sort of mechanisms that make artists visible weren't as prolific as they are now. Now, if you want to see art in the UAE, you can go to Art Jamil, Sharjah Art Foundation, you can go to Al Serkal, you can go to NYU Abu Dhabi, you can go to Monarat, you can go to Warehouse 421. If you know the secret code, you can go to Bay 15. And there's many more places where you can at least go and ask, where do I find the artist today? And I think this was the challenge in the 90s, is that if you're coming from the outside, I knew a lot of artists who came to the UAE in that period and had exactly your experience. And it's heartening that you stuck it out and you eventually found Tashkil and built your community from there. So I'd like to hear from each of you, and maybe you can each spend a minute thinking about this, but how did you sort of identify, there is an art world and I want to be a part of it, or not, maybe I don't want to be. But what did you see? What was sort of your first point of contact with the community of artists and art making in the UAE that sort of became your entree or your way into life in the arts in the UAE? And if you can, that'll hopefully give our audience a picture of the culture there, but also how things are changing now. So if you can do a flashback and then to the present, and then what's going to happen next. And so why don't we start with the flashback? 30 seconds, you're on.
Quick flashback. I had just moved back from New York and I had interned with the Guggenheim in New York, and not in the Abu Dhabi department. I was in the development department. I was dragging my feet almost every day there. And then one day I ended up meeting Reem Fadda, who was curating Venice at the time. And she kind of took me under her wing and started talking to me a lot about the sort of the contemporary artists that exist. So I learned about Mohammed Kadhim, who's showing in this exhibition, and later was an intern at that year's Venice. I moved back. I came in, and I was working at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I was just kind of curious. I thought that there was a lot going on, and at the time there was a lot of the DIFC openings. And so I would just kind of make myself present at these openings to introduce myself to artists or to hear artists speak. And then I started to realize that something that I wanted to participate in is telling these stories or tying these stories together. So it went from these kind of events that were very eventful, but just for the night, to having today a continuous art scene that's always alive. There's always something going on, whether you're fluctuating between the institutions that do exist or the grassroots initiatives that also do exist. Your hands are full. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to look at. There's a lot of artists that are coming up, and what's exciting now is that there are a lot of curators coming up too. And I think for me, it's a feat in its own self. I guess kind of sandwiching between then and now. What in 2017 I had realized was that in specific to Abu Dhabi, that we these institutions, yes, can go on, but what is needed is a sort of grassroots, a start of something that's grassroots initiated, and for the voices to kind of come from the ground up as opposed to the top down, just to create a bridge between what the institutions are doing and to kind of bring it back to what's happening on a more community level. And from 2017 up until now, I've seen everything that I've hoped to change. And I think that within itself is an exact reflection of sort of the efforts that are being taken from all. It's like individual responsibility as much as it is institutional responsibility to get to where the UAE, I think, wants to be on a creative level or creative ecosystem.
Thank you. Hashel?
Yeah. Funny enough, like Munira and I were in New York at the same time.
But didn't know each other.
We didn't know each other until we both moved back to Abu Dhabi and kind of like met and joined forces. But also I left in 2007, and there was like, almost just Dubai, Bastakia, and Sharjah. And then from there, and also Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi, but the options were very limited for artists or artist community to exist or like gather or like also exhibit or show. But in the past, I would say like 10 or like 5 to 7 years, I think there was a lot that developed and happened. And it's a natural progress. Like UAE is celebrating its 50th Jubilee anniversary, so culture like arrives, after like all of the infrastructure is like being placed in its right position, and also like the development of the educational programs there, like NYU Abu Dhabi now they're offering visual arts. There's ZU Said University is also offering different programs, and I think slowly like things are changing and shifting towards the ecosystem that we're all talking about somehow.
I think that's a really good point, that the infrastructure, when in the 1970s, there wasn't a paved road from Abu Dhabi to Dubai. We got to get those roads in place. You got to get your education and your healthcare in place. Yeah. The culture was there. The artists were working, but the space for making still had to be made, I think, in many ways. Yeah. Or that it was being made, but on such an individual level, sort of like the grassroots part 1, and now we're in grassroots part 2, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think it's important also for artists to have a role and like understand, because like there's so much that the system can provide, but also there is like your personal needs as an artist to kind of like respond and like, I need a studio, then I need to figure out how to make a studio.
Exactly.
And join forces with peers. I think that's important as well.
Yeah. Which is the story of most great artists come from some impulse like that. Yeah. Solimar. So when you first arrived, it seemed like there was nothing there. So then you continue your practice in whatever way. At what point do you sort of start to connect to the creative community in the UAE?
I was seeking out work, doing custom design carpets, because I had left New York, and that's what I was doing. In my own time, I was doing my own paintings and drawings, but just to continue the design practice, because I also love that. I had to really search for, people that were receptive to that idea. But yeah, in 1997, I didn't meet a lot of creative people. It's funny. It's like, I'm like, where are they? It was kind of like a lonely journey. And I have 2 sons, Talal and Ziad, whom Hashel and Munira know very well, and Danny. And I would drive them to their school, Rashid School for Boys, in Al Shiba. And so Tashkil was founded in 2008. And I used to pass it, but I didn't know what it was exactly. And then Talal actually took some classes there through his school. So I thought it was just for kids. So I was still seeking a community, because I think as a creative person, I think it's really important to be connected to other creative people and support each other, like what I have at Tashkil, it's intergenerations, there's really young people coming in who are joining, and older people in all levels, all different backgrounds in education and with their own journey and their career. And when you're there, there's kind of this energy that's out there, and just that kind of support. So when I joined Tashkil, I felt like, great, this is a place I can really like take things that I've been working on and now put them through different processes and see what happens, and how things will move forward. So it's like a language, right? Yeah. Visual arts is a language. That's why poets write words and writers write amazing words, and artists try to express through colors and through shapes and motion in different processes to try to communicate a feeling or an energy that we feel as I feel as a creative person needs to come out and be out in the world and connect with more people who can relate somehow.
This is so really, it was, in a way, it was your children that found the key to the door that for you led the way into this kind of return to a creative community. And I've heard 2008 is often sort of talked about as this watershed moment where a whole series of galleries open and initiatives start, and Tashkil being among these as well. And I feel like that is the moment where things start to really kind of come above the surface and become a little bit more locatable, I think.
And I think that there's more coming. Yeah. I think there needs to be more like communities set up like this, like these kind of art studios, like that support this creative process. And it's a place where artists and curators and just creative people can meet, exchange, also have their own space to create, maybe bounce ideas off others, you know,
I
who
think
can
the whole
relate.
world needs one
And
of these.
even when I moved there, I mean, I didn't meet a lot of curators either. So it was still like, of course, the artists were there and the creative, but they weren't. I think they were all seeking, like, where do we go?
Yeah.
So
thank you. That's good to hear. So now we have the story. I hope I've painted a picture for you. I think we have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. Burning questions about art in the UAE, art and culture, art and the world. Yes.
Maya, I want to ask you a question. Can you talk a little bit about the arts program at NYU Abu Dhabi and, you know, the students who's signing up? What are they studying? You have an MFA program that's about to be launched, I believe, by one of the artists here, Tariq El Hussein. Because I know what has been lacking. I mean, some schools have been teaching art and design, like I think the American University of Sharjah, but there's been sort of speaking of a lack of infrastructure, there hasn't been a lot of arts education, was my understanding at a sort of a higher level. So maybe you could address what's happening now in arts education.
So arts education is a very interesting subject because I think it has been happening informally and through these kind of community-based contexts, starting in the late 70s, early 80s for sure, and certainly in the schools up through K through 12. College art education becomes a thing only, I would say, in the last couple decades. I would think mid 2000s is when the Sharjah University of Art, Sharjah, the one,
that launched,
I gotta get these to roll off my tongue faster. So NYU comes in, and right off the bat, we know that we're going to commit to developing the arts. And this is, remember, the launch of NYU Abu Dhabi coincides with the announcement of the launch of the Louvre Abu Dhabi and the Guggenheim. And there's this real sense of, we're investing in the future of arts and culture in the UAE. And if you're going to invest in that future, you need to invest in the students and in the education of that future. And so NYU Abu Dhabi made that commitment. And one of the things that they have is an arts program where you can major in art, but it's art and art history together. And then you can have a focus on either studio practice or art history. But you learn both all the way through, which is really a nice way to do it, especially for undergraduate. And now they've launched a Master's in Fine Arts program. And this is the very first year of that, and it's the first one in the UAE. So Zayed University also has an excellent visual arts programming, and the students coming out of there are doing incredible work as well. And then Sharjah has 2 universities that teach art and architecture. So it's actually, I think what we're seeing is the payoff of that early investment in education that starts around this 2008 period, which is that watershed moment. And then when the Salama Foundation invests in the Emerging Artist Fellowship, now every year there's this cohort of how many, like 8 to 10, 12 students?
16.
16 a year of like professionalized, students who, they aren't even students anymore. These are practicing artists who are kind of going to the next level in their career. And, we think, there's just a few practicing artists. Every single year, amazing groups of artists are emerging out of this cohort. So we have students graduating from all these different colleges with an artistic practice, and we have the cohorts. The layers upon layers of artists that are emerging right now is just so heartening to see for me. Yeah, so I could go on ad nauseum, so I'll stop there.
Any other questions from the floor? If none, I would like, yes?
Oh, there's one, 2.
Thank you. I wasn't actually expected to speak into a microphone and be on the spot. But anyway, I've really enjoyed this. Our first time actually at a lecture at MEI. And one of the reasons I most enjoyed this hearing this evening is because it's really fabulous to hear how the creative community has developed in the UAE, particularly, as you said, at the grassroots level, and also blended with the support of higher institutions. And I assume there's also a lot of government support. I don't know if you can comment on this, but can you comment how, obviously in the UAE, it seems like the contemporary art scene is well developed on their way and very supportive, but beyond UAE and the rest of the Middle East, Do you know of, or can you shed some light on, are there any other countries, whether it's Egypt to Lebanon or what have you, that are doing as well as you are in terms of the grassroots levels, contemporary art, and support from their governments? Now, obviously, you have the infrastructure here. For instance, I'll put them on the spot. My husband here is from Lebanon, so we're very familiar with the Lebanese contemporary art scene, but they may not have the same infrastructure and support that you have. So I'm wondering if you could just shed some light maybe on what's happening elsewhere in the Middle East in terms of contemporary art. I don't know if that question is appropriate or not, but thank you.
That's perfectly fine. And we're, the UAE, I'm going to let you take this one, but I can't stop talking. So the UAE is really not an island, right? We're actually part of this whole peninsula. And all these artists that, that we're looking at historically in the last 30 years, 40 years in the UAE, they were all sort of interacting with other artists clusters around the Gulf. And I can speak more to that than I can to the larger Arab world, but I'm going to go ahead. There's so much to say, so let's see if we can find the short version of this answer. Yes, but go ahead.
I will also talk about the Gulf more than the rest of the Arab world, because that's what I'm acquainted with and what I know. But I mean, if we're to kind of quickly jump across the Gulf, looking at Saudi Arabia, for example, today, like only in this month, there are like 3 or 4 huge events. There's a lot of sort of government support coming in for the creative scene. But what's interesting about Saudi is that initially it started on a more grassroots level, and now there's more of a governmental sort of funding and support. So they're bridging kind of in opposite to us somehow. If you look at Kuwait is a hugely grassroots space. They run a lot of creative grassroots initiatives and platforms come out of Kuwait. You have, you had up until 2 years ago, a creative conference called Nuqat that took place in Kuwait to highlight creatives in the Arabic language. So that everybody that was coming to do a lecture was speaking in Arabic, to bring back the role of language, which is, you can't deny it's a huge part of what culture is. So you have the likes of Saudi and Kuwait that are doing things, Bahrain on a quieter tone. And I mean, biases aside, but I just think that the UAE is at a very particular time in its history, and cannot really be compared to the rest of the Gulf in the same way that the rest of the Gulf cannot be compared to the UAE. But you also have, of course, Qatar with their huge museums and their constant interest in collecting modern art and from the Arab world, and that sort of support. But what becomes interesting about the UAE is you have individuals, you have individuals like Sultan Qasimi, for example, pioneering this collection of modernist Arab movements, and then also creating a lot of research around it. So I think it's a difficult question to answer, and I don't know if I answered it, but within the Gulf, I would say that there is a lot that is taking place. And what's interesting is when the countries cross over, and you have the creative spilling over from one country into the next.
Yeah, in addition to that, also Oman yesterday announced that they're participating in Venice. Mm-hmm. And that makes like the second GCC country to be in Venice.
Saudi, UAE, and Oman.
Third. Yeah. So yeah. And looking back in like recent history, early 70s or 80s, a lot of artists such as Dr. Najat Makki and I think Abdul Qadir went to Egypt. That was like a big movement where they were getting trained there. So there is like a cross connection between.
That's true. Yeah. A huge number from that generation studied in Cairo.
Mm-hmm. In Cairo.
I think the positive, what's happening in the Gulf and especially in the Emirates, it's opened more doors actually to all the other Arab countries, because there's a lot of Lebanese and Egyptians and people from all over the Middle East in the UAE. And I feel because of the changes and kind of a boom of the art scene that's kind of evolved in the last 10 years, and even more so in the last 5 years. I feel there's just so much more that's going to come and happen and evolve in a really positive way. So I feel like it actually benefits everyone in the region. They can't change economic problems or crises in different, countries, but in the art scene specifically, it really opens the door, and that's what's special about the Emirates, I feel, is that they don't discriminate. It's a country that welcomes all nationalities, and if you're willing to do the work and your heart is into it, there's nothing that can stop you. No nationality is, it's just the doors are open. So I feel like it's positive.
Absolutely.
The doors have opened, so the Emirates has made a huge difference, I feel.
And we have one last question. Yeah.
Hi. A beautiful exhibition, and thank you for being here with us and talking about kind of your experiences. And I wanted to ask a question to all of you and maybe delve down briefly kind of into what inspired you to be artists. Was there this one person that, whether an art teacher that kind of was always supporting you, or but it's interesting because not a lot of schools in the UAE actually promote art. You would have that one teacher that would really you look up to and aspire to become an artist when the art scene was not really ready or there yet. So can you just talk about who that person is?
There's a whole list of
in 30 seconds.
For me, growing up, Dr. Najat Makki was an important figure. I used to go to her house and Bastakia near to the galleries, XBA and Majlis, and she would train me. That's
I didn't know
30
that.
seconds.
30
Yeah.
Okay, next.
I didn't grow up in the Emirates, but I think in most cultures, in a way, parents worry if their kids really want to pursue art in general. Even in the United States, parents worry, like, you want to study art and then what, But I can remember from a young age, my parents always encouraged me. I would always draw, and I would always visualize things and shapes, and then I'd make up a story. And I can remember they were very encouraging of that. And later in years, I was thinking, like, I wonder why they never encouraged me to do anything else, because I'm good at other things too, Like my dad said, you would have been a good nurse. And I said, yeah, but you never told me, like, why don't you, you know what I mean? But I was encouraged, that's my
Is this a question that you would
and
be
good
able...
teachers, teachers that said, yeah, that their input, they kind of, like, you feel as a child growing up, at least I did with art teachers, I felt encouragement, a lot of encouragement.
So I, from a very young age, have a journal entry from grade 3 that I had written that when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut or an artist, one or the other. And I grew up in a school where at the time English, was my second language, native to Arabic, predominantly American school. I was the only Emirati for a very long time ahead and behind me. And so I found sort of refuge in the art class, and my art teachers always kind of kept me together throughout. And then I graduated and I wanted to go into art school, and ended up doing a year of law because, as you were saying, with regards to parents kind of having more influence on that. And I finished my year of law, and I was like, it's either I do art or I do nothing at all. And that's how kind of things just moved in that direction very naturally for me from a young age, I think.
Thank you guys so much, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. That is a great question and a great note to close this conversation, but to close it only so that we all move to the gallery and enjoy this exhibition. Please continue the conversation with us all, with our panelists. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for the great conversation. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you.
Munira, Hashel, and Solimar, welcome, and enjoy the evening. Also, we have drinks and finger food outside, so you can mingle outside as well and continue the conversation. We are open until 8 p.m. today as part of First Friday. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.